I started as a public school teacher, both my wife and I, and really got interested in the changes that were occurring. I started teaching in 1968, and both my wife and I got along well with kids who were troublemakers. At the time, I couldn't have explained why, particularly. Now I would say, well, because we were being restorative. That is, we were engaging them in a certain way and so on. But my wife actually had a little classroom of 12 kids one year. They took the worst kids in her large elementary school, the worst, well, the kids the teachers wanted least in their classes, and she took them and put them in one room and worked with them. And, you know, we were concerned about the increasingly inappropriate behavior. The boundaries of behavior in schools was expanding out to be increasingly actually outrageous at times. And the way the schools were reacting to it was actually to make things worse. I mean, they were alienating kids who really needed someone to somehow engage them. And, you know, you've all heard the phrase, the school to prison pipeline. And I think that's a lot of what zero tolerance has done. The whole notion of taking what was, I guess, initially a drug policy into schools and suggesting that even the smallest infractions be responded to very strongly, often with suspensions at least, or detentions, well, at the least. And so we were growing up in that era as, you know, new young professional teachers, and didn't know quite what to make of it. And at the same time, we started working as volunteers in a juvenile court group home. And, you know, the kids could be delightful and they could be horrendous and everything in between in their behaviors. But we really got fascinated with just how is it that people get on a negative path in life, and how might we encourage them to get onto a positive path. And that, in fact, I guess is the question that's kind of obsessed us both ever since then. So in the talk I prepared, I'll come in sort of at that point and, you know, sort of looking at the clock, but I think some of this is relevant and it gives a little more foundation. The issue of public schools really, I think, was my first interest. I really got into criminal justice accidentally. That is, well, we were volunteers in the group home, and that gave us some interest, but I was really interested in different approaches to education, some of which I know now were foolish. I had a lot of hippy-dippy notions. I wanted a way in which I could try out some of my theories about how to better educate kids. And it occurred to us at some point for me, it was about 8 years into my public school teaching, that in fact, the courts would be a great way to do it, because they actually didn't care what you did with the kids all day, relatively speaking. That is, if they sent you to a program, if you managed to get some behavioral improvement, they weren't concerned about your teaching methods. So it was sort of a walking backwards into a situation where, okay, well, maybe let's start a school for juvenile court kids. And so that would have been about 1976 that we quit our jobs in the public schools, started a little nonprofit, and jumped off the proverbial cliff of nonprofit organization. It took a few years to get back into the middle class, but it was a sobering experience too, because we started in order to make some money while we were learning how to get an organization started. We went to the Children and Youth Agency and the juvenile court and said, we had learned people get paid for being foster parents. If they're willing to take really tough kids, they were willing to pay more substantial money, and you didn't pay any tax. You were obviously supposed to use the money to help with the kids. For us, to be quite honest, we had a little rented house at the time, my 2 little sons, and we thought cleverly that we should start where it would be easier by dealing with teenage girls. That was, one of the first sobering lessons of, I mean, it was just harder emotionally, and I mean, boys do more outrageous things generally, although I remember that one of the first nights we had one of the girls with us, she tried to attack me with a sort of a rug knitting, a knitting kind of tool. And I don't think she actually wanted to hurt me, but I had no idea what to do. I sat on her after taking it from her while I'm on the phone calling the Children and Youth Agency, who were our supposed guides in this adventure of being foster parents, and asked them what to do, and they said, call the police. And that was it. So all of that, I'll be candid looking at it now, the inept management of foster care people that were, offering to help the county agencies, terrible support, no training. It just got us interested in what we could do differently. And so that was kind of the beginning of it for us. We did then start a school, and that took a while to get a license. Dealing with state bureaucracies became an educational experience. And so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you, and after traveling for all these hours, I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to speak. I was asked to talk about restorative justice, but I asked if I could talk about restorative practices as well, and explain the distinction in terminology. And I'd like to share some stories from our organization's books and films. Most importantly, I'd like to give you a clear understanding of what we call the fundamental hypothesis of restorative practices, that people are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. And physics has been searching for a unified grand theory of everything since Einstein, and they still haven't put it together. We'd like to argue that this rather simplistic premise is a way of explaining how to get the best in any social entity, whether as a parent in a family, a teacher in a classroom, a manager in a business, principal in a school, and I presume you could take it up to nations. It is actually a way of looking at how we might exercise our authority with grace. And it's nothing new, and good leaders, good parents, good teachers do the things that relate to engaging people and doing things with them, but they do it intuitively. And what we're about in part in restorative practices is trying to define practices and support them with good theory that gets people to do these things on purpose all the time. And inevitably people will say, oh, well, we do what you guys do, exactly. But can you talk about it explicitly? And we've been working toward that goal. And so I first ran into the term restorative justice from Terry OConnell. I don't actually think print's big enough I can actually read this. I learned about restorative justice from Terry OConnell, an Australian police officer who in 1994 came to my home community in Pennsylvania, and he spoke about the Restorative Conference process he had developed as part of a community policing initiative. He's since become a friend and colleague and serves as the director of our affiliate in Australia, Real Justice Australia. An integral part of his approach is a series of questions. that we've come to call the restorative questions. They are at the heart of every restorative conference as we teach restorative conferencing, beginning with offenders, then the victims, then the family and friends of the victims, then the family and friends of the offenders. The facilitator of the conference gives each person in the circle a chance to speak without interruption, prompted by several open-ended questions. The questions on these cards are similar to the questions asked in the conference. They're designed to elicit from people who have caused harm to others their perspective on what happened, what they were thinking about at the time, who they've affected, how they've affected them, and what they might do to make things right. We never ask why, because it's a foolish question. People who've done something impulsive, impetuous, really don't know why. And it actually, we found it over time to be the least useful question that you can ask. But you get close to it by asking people what they were thinking about at the time, because it gets them into the context of when it happened. There's a similar set of questions we can ask that provide a similar opportunity, open-ended questions on the other side, that are really for those who've been harmed by someone. And they're more specialized questions in the conference because you actually distinguish between the family and friends of the victim and the family and friends of the offender. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't often think of the family and friends of the offenders as being victims, but they actually have been severely traumatized by what someone they love did to other human beings and the effect it's had on all their lives. There's little or nothing in the criminal justice system that provides an equivalent opportunity as a restorative conference. Criminal justice court is as useful as a decision-making process. It's really critical that somebody can determine whether someone is guilty or not, and restorative justice will not replace that. But there's a need to do something more. And as my friend Terry O'Connell explains, I like his phrase, the major benefit of a restorative conference is that all of the participants gain a shared understanding of how everyone has been affected by an incident. One might ask, well, so what? Well, because whether the offender goes to prison or not, there is still a need to deal with and reduce the impact of crime. Long after the criminal justice system has done its thing, people struggle with their trauma. My organization, the International Institute for Restorative Practices, distributes a film that won the award for the best documentary of 1999 in Australia. It's named Facing the Demons. The film's about a restorative conference that Terry ran, actually. It was on public television, ABC, they call it, the Australian public television. It's an hour film, and it was about a conference that Terry convened 4.5 years after the murder of Michael Marslew in a bungled armed robbery at a Pizza Hut in the suburbs of Sydney, Australia. And you realize when you watch the film, the time does not heal all wounds. In fact, many of Michael's friends and family were still struggling as if the crime had just happened. Their greatest emotional resolution did not occur until they walked into a meeting room adjacent to a prison and sat down in a circle with 2 of the 4 men involved in the deadly robbery. And through the conference process, which lasted several hours, gained a shared understanding of how everyone had been affected by the crime. The benefit derived from the encounter, that opportunity to face the demons, was powerful. Sarah, Michael's friend, for 4.5 years after the murder, continued to be immobilized. She had quit her studies at university, avoided socializing, and spent a lot of time hanging around her parents' home. 2 weeks after this encounter, this conference, she went on a vacation toward the American Southwest and went back to university. Brendan, Michael's friend since they were babies, also struggled. But after the conference, he was able to talk about the ordeal with Michael's parents, something he had always avoided. And now, 4.5 years after the incident, after the conference, finally decided to get his driver's license. Joan, Michael's mother, for 4.5 years, could not remember the good years of her son's life. So traumatized by the night she had to go to the morgue to identify her son's body, the only image she could see was, when she thought of her son, was his blood-soaked face. The trauma that had persisted through support groups and years of therapy after the conference was reduced in intensity. The bloody image faded, and all of her memories and images of Michael's childhood and teenage years gradually came back to her. I'll just mention this as a plug for professors and others who might be interested. These materials are available. There's interviews a year to a year and a half after the conference, when people have a chance, because there's some quick glimpses, Facing the Demons. They're all pretty inexpensive, and the idea is to make this direct experience available to people, because a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a motion picture is worth 10,000 pictures. And it's really compelling to see how people change as a result of this encounter. So Dr. Carolyn Angel at the University of Pennsylvania has studied the effects of restorative conferences on burglary and robbery victims. She said about her research results, I'll quote her, "The most striking thing was that conferences reduced symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. What you have here is a one-time program that's effective in producing benefits for the majority of people." She characterized the Restorative Justice Conference as, quote, "an incredibly important public health benefit." So we often judge the emotional impact of a crime by the severity of the offense, but lesser crimes often wreak havoc on people's lives, not because of physical harm, but because the crime disrupts their feelings of safety and normality. Terry, when I was in Australia many years ago, told me about the theft of a motorbike from the porch of a suburban home. No big deal, just a motorbike, not much expense, no violence. The family consisted of a mom and a dad and 4 little girls who ranged from 4 to 12 years of age. And Terry called the mother on the phone and asked if she wanted to participate in a restorative conference with the 2 teenage boys who had been apprehended and who admitted to the offense. She said, "No, we would be too terrified. I'm going to get counselors. My family has been severely traumatized." Terry responded sympathetically, asked if he could come and speak to the family personally to explain how the conference might address that fear and trauma. The mother agreed, and after his visit, the family eventually agreed to participate in a conference. In the conference, the mother spoke emotionally to the boys, as did the oldest sister. Both spoke in general terms about how the theft had traumatized the younger sisters. Although they only talked in general terms in the conference, Terry later learned that the youngest sister, after the incident, started wetting her bed. The next oldest sister insisted on sleeping all night with her parents. The second oldest sister wouldn't go out in the backyard after dark. Because the motorbike was recovered, there was no financial restitution involved. The agreement made in the conference focused on apologies and community service work. After the conference ended and the offenders left, Terry chatted with the family. The mother assured him that the conference had brought her family closure. She said that she had no idea how they would have effectively dealt with the aftermath of this event without the conference. And the 12-year-old began to cry. with her younger sisters watching her. I really felt sorry for those boys. They're just like the boys down the road. So for her and her sisters, the face-to-face meeting with the boys made the offenders real and normal, removing the fear from their nights. So when Terry followed up a week later, the mother said that the conference had been a fabulous experience for the family. The girls had not stopped talking about it. The issues of trauma had not surfaced again, and the family's life had returned to normal. So, what's the purpose of the criminal justice system? In truth, it's not very good at reducing crime. There's not a lot of compelling evidence that it does that. But according to Carolyn Angel's evidence, and there's others, putting some time and energy into the real needs of victims, you could actually reduce the impact of crime. For the 17 years before I met Terry OConnell in 1994, my wife and I were running a nonprofit organization that operates schools and group homes for delinquent and at-risk youth, which I did in my preamble and wasn't in the original talk. I was so excited by the idea of conferencing that I went to Australia to visit with Terry and his colleagues and to visit a school that was using restorative conferences to respond to behavioral problems like bullying, fights, and truancy. I brought along a video crew, which is one of the craziest things I ever did. But I met this young Australian guy who was a professional video guy, and he wanted to go home and was willing to do it cheap if I paid his way. So we recorded interviews and other experiences, and I talked with Terry about my interest in developing a training program called Real Justice to spread conferencing around the world. I hired him to come back to Pennsylvania to train the staff of our schools and group homes a few months later. On his visit, on his visit with us, Terry spent a day at one of our schools, and at the end of the day, he described our schools as running a conference all day long. And it was a revelation to me that had not occurred to me until he shared his impression of our school environment. And I began to realize that we didn't need to limit our use of restorative justice to formal processes, but we could use restorative justice in everyday life. In 1999, we began to use the term restorative practices to define both the formal restorative justice conference with which we can respond to wrongdoing, but also define the informal and proactive practices that we were using all day long in our schools and group homes. Also in '99, we decided to found the International Institute for Restorative Practices. We started informally that year, registered the next year in 2000 as the institute as a nonprofit corporation, and began the arduous process of authorization as a master's degree granting graduate school. Honestly, if I had known how hard it was going to be, I never would have started. But in 2006, not only did the Pennsylvania Department of Education authorize our new institution, but in doing so, it recognized restorative practices as a new social science. And that's probably what we did most of the 6 years, was build the case and collect the literature, and they finally went along with us. Again in '99, we began the first of 3 research studies that confirmed the impact of restorative practices on reducing criminal offenses among delinquent and at-risk youth. Paul McCold, actually a graduate of SUNY Albany, the criminal justice research scientist who evaluated our school and group home programs, warned us that during the preceding decade, in which he had evaluated over 50 youth-serving programs for the New York State Division of Youth, he'd been unable to find sufficient evidence to show that any of those programs changed the behavior of the young people that they served. So we were delighted when, in the first evaluation of about 900 young people discharged from our programs over '99 to 2001, that our programs produced positive results in youth in 3 key performance measures. The restorative milieu, as McColl termed the environment in our schools, delivered high program completion rates, positive changes in attitudes, and most significantly, cut offending in half among young people who were in our program for 3 months or more. A second evaluation of almost 900 youths during 2001 and 03, and the third, much larger evaluation with over 2,000 young people during the 2003-2006 period, confirmed the power of the restorative milieu to more than half offending rates. The fourth development in '99 was that we began to offer restorative practices training in public schools. 10 years later, we published Improving School Climate, findings from schools implementing restorative practices, reporting outcomes from Canada, the UK, and US. And in school after school and in whole school districts, behavioral incidents declined, and not surprisingly, so did suspensions and expulsions after staff had been trained in restorative practices. And for those of you interested, this is on a website called Safer, Saner Schools, and the Improving School Climate is there, as is a film I'm going to mention. But I think the important thing to say for anyone who's interested in research, we couldn't figure out how to do a randomized control study. We had to use alternative ways of being scientific in the evaluation, simply because we couldn't get courts and school districts who sent us kids to send 10 to 15% of them and pay for a program that they didn't actually think would work as well. So as a practical matter, we're now working with people to try to do just that, and do randomized studies in schools and between schools. And we have some proposals pending with some people from Rutgers and with Rand Corporation. So what is it about restorative practices, including restorative justice, that helps staff in schools and other kinds of youth-serving programs get better results with young people? The principle is very straightforward. You change the nature of the relationship between adults and young people. You stop doing things to people or for people, and you start doing things with them. Just as you do in the Restorative Conference, you give the offender an opportunity to be heard, to have voice, but you also insist that they take responsibility and that they consider how they might, to the extent that is possible, make things right. So what does that look like? Let's take a look at West Philadelphia High School, where we started working in August 2007. The local media called it the worst high school in that city. A reporter told us that on a slow news day, he would just park outside the school and wait for something to happen, because there were fights or fires set almost every day. For 6 years in a row, West Philly had been on the federally mandated persistently dangerous school list. So even before we did a training there, the assistant principal came to a one-day conference we held in the city in May 2007. I say the time of year, it was May, the school year was ending. And he went back to school with one of our restorative question cards. And he decided, instead of doing his usual thing when students sent to his office, lecturing them, handing out detentions and suspensions, he asked the restorative questions. So what happened? And he let them talk. And what were you thinking about at the time? And he realized he was providing a useful and respectful way to get the student to think about his or her behavior. Who has been affected? How have they been affected? These kinds of questions foster empathy and insight into the consequences of someone's actions. And lastly, getting them to talk about how to resolve the issue or clean up the bad feelings they may have caused allowed them the opportunity to redeem themselves. Because mostly what we do with punishment is we stigmatize people, and we don't have a path back. It's really hard for people who've been labeled in schools or by the justice system to find a way back from that stigma, to be reintegrated in school or society. And what surprised the assistant principal the most was the fact that students who he had been seeing in his office every day, who were sent to the office by their teachers, showed up less frequently or not at all. And the quality of his interactions with students in trouble changed significantly. They became more positive and friendly. He felt that giving students the opportunity to be heard, even when they had done something wrong, changed his relationship with them. Then in June, we did a 2-hour info session for teachers, trying to persuade them to come back for 2 days in August for training, because there was no money to pay for teachers to come in the summer. So they had to believe it would be something useful to them. More than 90% of them showed up voluntarily for both days, and when the school year began, they started doing proactive circles. The circles can be as simple as asking people, what their summer was like, giving them a chance to talk, and then doing it check-in and check-out circles in the week. How was your weekend? As kids become accustomed, they start talking about very real things, about the fight with mom this weekend, and another kid sharing how that happened. The kids begin to have some time and space when they're not being directed by an authority figure, and the conversation is totally controlled by that authority figure. But a limited amount, 5 minutes at the beginning of the day, 5 minutes at the end. It's not the quantity, it's changing the nature of the relationship and the opportunity for people to have voice in ways that we don't typically provide in schools, in West Philadelphia High School anyway. So there's a 9-minute video you can watch on the main page of the Safer Saner Schools website. No narration, just interviews, snippets of interviews with 2 school administrators, 3 teachers, and 6 students. So here's one of the teachers from the video describing her personal quest for a better way to manage her classroom. We punish kids, but we never really talk to them. I personally have an issue with that as a teacher. Sometimes you need to talk, and that's what I think restorative practices gives us. I needed to find something that would help me have a different kind of interaction with my students. And the main thing that I liked initially about restorative practices was the whole idea of building a community. So in September, when we started school, the principal encouraged us to use the circles, kind of just to build a family. I started doing that in my classes, and I liked it, and I found that my students liked it as well. And I can feel that we now have more of a family interaction this year. I can see the difference in my students, and I also see the difference in my behavior. Because I can be very aggressive, and I am very aggressive with my students, and I needed not to be. Another teacher explains, as a school that has a lot of social climate issues, utilizing restorative practices and building positive social culture is essential to the functioning of any school. I mean, it's essential. Content and material mean nothing without relationships. There was a sort of looming conflict between 2 groups of girls. It was pretty evident that something physical was going to happen. And so myself and another teacher and a security guard sort of took it upon ourselves to try to reach an agreement between the girls and really get to the bottom of why this was happening. So we used the circle and some of the other conference training we received from restorative practices. And so we implemented the circle, and the girls never fought. Because 95% of the problems that we have are miscommunication. And so the act of communicating without using violence is a powerful act. The principal and assistant principal described their use of circles to help a teacher who was struggling to maintain order in her classroom. We tried a restorative practices conference. We asked the teacher, could we put the kids in a circle and could we have them share their perception about what's happening in your class, and would you be open to hearing that? So the teacher was very good about being comfortable with being vulnerable in that way. The kids took it very seriously. They had some very clear and concrete things to say about their role in the class and why maybe they weren't doing the things they should have been doing, what they saw as the teacher's role and why things weren't going the way they should go in the class. And to the teacher's credit, she took notes and she really did try to make corrections in terms of what the kids had talked about. And the assistant principal says, I think the turning moment, and I could see it in the students' faces, was when they realized they had a say. They realized they were participants and they were going to be listened to, and they could have input. In the video, students refer to their experience with restorative practices as circles. They don't use the vocabulary restorative practices. Their perceptions of what changed in their school were heartfelt and compelling, and these are each different students going back. Before we had circles at our school, there were lots of fights, riots, and problems. It was just a lot of confusion. I think circles help because it expresses the students' feelings and stuff more. Instead of violence and stuff, just talking in a circle could avoid violence. Before we had circles in our school was always just crazy, wild, and there was nothing else to do. Now that we have circles at our school, it's more like calm and collected, and we get to talk about our peers and staff respectfully and tell them how we feel and what's the problem. Kids aren't so much afraid, they listen to one another, what they have to say, and they kind of agree with one another. Circles have changed our class because we've had to talk to one another. It's not just the teachers, it's all of us together. So we've kind of had to come together as a team and talk. When somebody's bothering me, circles help me relax because I'm talking to somebody. With me, when I'm frustrated or sad and all those other emotions, I need to talk to somebody. Circles help people behave because you get to tell everybody about you, what's going on. You get to express your feelings, your emotions, anything you got wrong. Circles have helped the school because now we don't have as many conflicts and fights and stuff. Everybody has their own opinion, and you get to hear what everybody has to say. And the assistant principal talks about the changes very specifically. He said a number of things have happened, have changed. One of the first things was the change in the climate and the attitude. That's the first thing that had to change on the road to recovery, and that has done so. As a result, at the end of last year, our violent acts and serious incidents were down 52%, the largest change in the city. This year so far, we're down an additional 45% over what we ended up with last year. And yes, West Philadelphia is off the persistently dangerous list. So let me tell you some restorative practice stories in higher education. In the first year restorative practices were implemented at the University of Vermont, there was an incident in which a student who was skateboarding in a hallway in violation of residential rules, he inadvertently hit a sprinkler head. Water surged through the hallways into the bedrooms. Firemen arrived and the building was evacuated, and students couldn't return to their room until 4 in the morning. With 10 rooms having such serious damage, those residents had to sleep elsewhere. Books, clothing, laptops, computers, beds were damaged or destroyed. And though the student came forward to admit what he had done, and his family's homeowner policy, insurance policy reimbursed the losses, the young man was ashamed to face his peers. Students were angry and upset, as rumors further exacerbated feelings by creating distorted accounts of what actually happened. While the authorities did not plan to impose punitive sanctions, in the past, such of an incident would have resulted in the young man moving to another residence hall in an effort to avoid the stigma. But since the advent of restorative practices at UVM, the residential life staff now had a more effective way to deal with the emotional aftermath by inviting the young man to participate in a restorative conference. The conference was held on a Sunday with 30 participants, all the students whose rooms and property had been damaged. The young man's roommate and his resident advisor, RA, were both there to support him. And the staff that organized and facilitated the conference appropriately prepared everyone beforehand by letting them know what to expect, what a conference is about. The skateboarder had the first opportunity to speak, and when the other students realized that the incident was truly an accident, their anger subsided. Contrary to rumors, he'd done nothing deliberate. And while he was not supposed to be skateboarding in the hallway, the consequence was obviously unintentional. He had no way of anticipating the damage that his actions would cause. And as the other students spoke, he also had an opportunity to truly understand how he had adversely affected so many people in his residential community. The person who facilitated the conference. It was, I think, their first. Said it went better than she'd expected. The next day, the students sent her an email saying, I was skeptical going into the conference. However, I'm real glad I was able to participate in this. I really understand how my actions affected my neighbors and fellow students. Satisfaction over the resolution of the incident was high because the conference resolved angry feelings, allowing the offender to be reintegrated into his community of peers, and it put the incident to rest. An RA who was among the most resistant to using restorative practices went to her director, exasperated about a group of students who were driving her crazy. She said that no matter what she did, the inappropriate behavior persisted. Most recently, over the weekend, she had written up discipline reports on 9 students who were drinking alcohol in the residence hall. And her director said, let's schedule a circle with all of them, and assured her that if it didn't work, they'd have to ask some of the students to move out of the residence hall. The director then facilitated a circle discussion with the students and the RA. And in the circle, the director asked, why do you think we're having this conversation now? The students acknowledged that it was because they'd been causing problems in the hall and for having been written up for alcohol use. He then asked, what impact do you think your behavior is having on the other residents and your RA? And the student tried to answer it, but the biggest reaction came when the RA herself spoke, and she said, I don't even want to go back in the hallway because I'm afraid of all of you and of what I'll find going on there. The students were shocked. They said, but we like you, and we didn't want to have this impact. Afterwards, they said that they really appreciated being able to have the conversation and have a word with both her and the director rather than just being punished. So when the director followed up with the RA a few days later, she reported that things were better on the floor. The director reminded her that the expectation was not that it would make things perfect forever and that the RA would eventually deal with more issues with that group of students. Nonetheless, the RA, who'd been known for her skeptical attitude towards restorative practices from the start, laughingly acknowledged, damn it, it worked again. But some use of restorative practices have nothing to do with wrongdoing. During UVM's first year of restorative practices implementation, a student who lived in one of the residence halls committed suicide. RAs immediately recognized the healing power of circles for resident students who were shocked, saddened, and deeply troubled by the incident. There was a huge turnout at the first circle held that night when 250 people gathered in the student union. And people heard things that clarified some of the rumors they'd been hearing. They had a chance to express their grief and confusion. The discussion was open for people to talk about their feelings, ask for more information. And when some people began to talk about what they wanted to do next in terms of memorializing the student, interacting with his parents, and what to do with belongings. And the next several nights, there were a series of community circles held throughout the students' residence complex. People checked in, and there were different needs expressed. Administrators felt the circle was a good format because there was no expectation of participation. People could show up or not, share what they needed to pass, or say, I don't know how I feel. And some said, on the other hand, this really triggered some stuff and I need to talk to the counseling staff later. The circle allowed for different directions, and some floor communities spent more time processing their feelings than others. But people in general felt comfortable sharing their feelings because they already had familiarity with each other from their normal hall meetings held every so many weeks, just having a chance to talk. So, although a growing number of educational institutions, higher education institutions, are using restorative justice to respond to wrongdoing, to the best of our knowledge, UVM is the only school so far that's undertaken implementation on such a large scale, including the whole range of proactive and responsive restorative practices that have produced a significant culture change in their residence halls. And while there's not a lot of data about restorative practices in residence life at UVM or elsewhere, one statistic stood out as a remarkable quantification of the benefit of restorative practices at UVM. Stacy Miller, the director there, talked about how every year by Christmas she lost 10 to 15% of her RAs because people find that job of being a peer and an authority figure a rather frustrating one. The year they implemented restorative practices, only one person quit. So, Niels Christie, the distinguished Norwegian criminologist, wrote a landmark essay in 1977 entitled Conflict is Property, and he argued that our conflicts belong to us and the courts and lawyers steal our conflicts, taking away our opportunity to resolve them and robbing us of whatever benefits might come from that. Schools and administrators do the same. Both courts and schools, whether or not they are mandated to deliver certain sanctions, miss a critical opportunity for people to resolve the emotional consequences of wrongdoing, conflicts, and problems with better results. So using restorative practices, including restorative justice, we can change that. Thanks.